This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin our investigation, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In September of 1982, a Geological Survey team working in the Buffalo National River area of Newton County, Arkansas, made a discovery that would quietly vanish from official records within 18 months. I've spent the better part of 3 years tracking down what remains of this case, and what I found challenges everything we think we understand about methodical scientific documentation. The Ozarks in 1982 were experiencing something of a renaissance in cave exploration. Federal funding had increased for geological surveys following several significant mineral discoveries in neighboring Missouri, and the University of Arkansas had partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey to map previously uncharted cave systems throughout the Boston Mountains. It was routine work, the kind that rarely makes headlines unless someone gets injured or discovers something commercially valuable. The team leader was a man named Virgil Harmon, 47 years old, a geologist with 22 years of experience mapping underground formations across 3 states. His field notes, which I obtained from a retired colleague who kept personal copies, describe him as methodical to the point of obsession and utterly uninterested in speculation. Harmon had worked in caves from Kentucky to New Mexico. He'd documented sinkholes, mapped water tables, and classified mineral deposits with the kind of precision that made his reports standard references in the field. With him that autumn were 3 others: Rosalind Vetch, a hydrogeologist from Little Rock who specialized in groundwater contamination studies; Camden Price, a graduate student in his 2nd year of fieldwork; and DeWitt Fisher, a local guide from Jasper who knew the Buffalo River watershed better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Fisher had been leading survey teams through these hills since 1971, after spending his younger years trapping and hunting in the same limestone hollows his grandfather had worked. The cave they entered on September 14th had no official designation. Local residents called it Shepherd's Drop, after a rancher who had lost 3 sheep down its entrance in the 1950s. The opening sat on private land belonging to the Shepherd family estate, though by 1982 the property had passed through probate and sat empty while distant relatives disputed the will. This detail would later become significant. What makes this case particularly compelling to me is how unremarkable everything seemed at first. The team's morning radio check with their base camp coordinator was routine. Weather was clear, temperature around 68 degrees, visibility good. They carried standard equipment, rope systems, helmets with carbide lamps, sample bags, surveying instruments, and a portable cassette recorder Harmon used to document observations while his hands were occupied with equipment or sample collection. The recorder was a Sony TCM 600, a professional model released in 1980 that journalists and field researchers favored for its durability. I mention the specific model because it becomes important later. Harmon had used this exact device on 43 previous surveys. According to equipment logs I recovered, it had never malfunctioned. They entered Shepherd's Drop at approximately 9:40 in the morning. The descent was straightforward, a 40-foot vertical shaft that opened into a horizontal passage heading roughly northeast. Fisher's handwritten map, which I examined at the Arkansas Geological Survey archives, shows the initial passage as 12 feet wide and 7 feet high, gradually narrowing over the first 100 yards. What I find notable about Fisher's mapping style is his habit of noting ambient sounds. Next to his elevation markers and width measurements, he'd written small annotations: water drip steady, or wind sound from North Passage, or echo suggests large chamber ahead. These weren't required notations. They were personal observations from someone who'd learned to read caves through sound as much as sight. At the 200-yard mark, Fisher noted silence became total. Then he'd crossed it out and written not silence, but absence of expected sound. I studied this correction for a long time before understanding what he meant. In caves, there's always sound, if you listen closely enough. Water moving somewhere, air currents, the settling of stone. Absolute silence in a cave often means you're in a sealed chamber with no air circulation, which presents its own dangers. But Fisher's correction suggests something different. Not silence, but the absence of sounds that should have been there. His map shows a stream channel running through the cave, fed by surface runoff. There should have been water sounds. The cave's entrance configuration should have created airflow, producing at least subtle wind noise. According to his annotations, neither was present after that 200-yard mark. Harmon's recorder ran continuously from the moment they entered. Standard practice was to leave it running and annotate the tape later, identifying the timestamp for each observation. The team would work for roughly 6 hours. Exit. And Harmon would spend the evening transcribing relevant portions while the observations were fresh. They reached a junction at approximately 11:15. 3 passages diverged, and standard protocol required them to survey each one sequentially, mapping as they went. They chose the leftmost passage first. Fisher's notes describe it as narrowing steadily, strong calcium carbonate deposits, dry. Just to remind you, you are listening to this story. The recorder captured 23 seconds before it disappeared inside the cave. OZARKS 1982 on the Gruesome Chronicles channel. If you are hearing this from another channel, please know that my video was copied and posted without my authorization. I kindly ask you to report it. Your support helps protect original content and allows me to continue bringing you these carefully researched stories. At 11:43, something changed. I know the precise time because Harmon called it out on the recording, a habit he maintained religiously. 11:43, approaching what appears to be a chamber expansion. Passage widens to approximately 18 feet. Ceiling height increasing. There is a pause, then his voice again. "Camden, hold the measure there. Need to calculate the grade change." Then there's another voice, not one of the team members. In my experience, reviewing field recordings, you learn to distinguish voices quickly. Harmon's was gravelly, weathered by years of smoking before he quit in 1979. Vetch's voice was higher, precise in its articulation. Price had a slight Oklahoma accent, softening his vowels. Fisher rarely spoke on recordings, but when he did, his voice carried the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who weighed every word. This fifth voice was none of those. It was male, seemingly middle-aged, and it spoke a single sentence. "You shouldn't have brought them here." The recording continues without interruption. Harmon finishes his measurement call-out. Vetch comments on the limestone composition. There's no acknowledgement of the voice, no question about who spoke or what was meant. When I first heard this section, I assumed I'd misheard. I've listened to it perhaps 200 times now. The voice is there, distinct and clear, positioned between Harmon's breathing and the scrape of boots on stone. It doesn't match any of the 4 team members. I've had 3 audio specialists examine it independently. All 3 confirm it's a separate voice, not an artifact of recording interference or acoustic distortion. But here's what troubles me more. There's no response to it. Professional survey teams, especially in confined spaces, maintain constant communication. An unexpected voice would trigger immediate reaction, questions, alarm. At minimum, a pause in work while they identified the speaker. The recording shows none of that. The survey continues seamlessly. Harmon calls out another measurement. Vetch asks Price to hand her a sample bag. It's as though no one else heard it. 14 minutes later, at 11:57, there's another anomaly. This time it's not a voice but a sound that Fisher's mapping notes had indicated shouldn't exist in this section. Running water. The acoustic pattern suggests significant flow, more than a simple drip or small stream. Harmon comments on it, asking Fisher if there's a known water source in this area. Fisher's response is barely audible on the tape, but I've had it amplified. There shouldn't be. Aquifer's 40 feet down from here. This section should be bone dry. Editum. They spend several minutes investigating, their voices growing slightly more animated, though still professionally controlled. Price suggests they're hearing water from a lower passage through a crack in the floor. Vetch proposes an unknown spring. Fisher remains quiet, which his later statement suggests indicated doubt. At 12:09, the recording quality begins to deteriorate. It's subtle at first, a slight warping of voices, as though the tape speed were fluctuating. But the equipment was battery-powered, and new batteries had been installed that morning. Technical failure was unlikely. At 12:14, Harmon says something that would later be analyzed extensively. Does anyone else feel that? There's a pause. Vetch responds, "Feel what?" The pressure change, like we're ascending, but we're not. Several seconds of silence follow, then Price, "Yeah, I feel it. My ears are. It's like being in an airplane." Fisher's voice, quiet. "We should mark this position and return to the junction." Harmon seems to consider this, then agrees. They begin the process of setting a survey marker, which involves photographing the location and recording precise measurements for later reference. This takes approximately 4 minutes. During this time, the tape quality continues to degrade, developing a strange reverb that shouldn't occur in a narrow passage with sound-dampening limestone. At 12:19, there's a sound on the recording that I still can't adequately describe. The closest comparison I can offer is the sound of a large piece of fabric being pulled taut, or perhaps a sail catching wind, but slower, more deliberate. It lasts approximately 7 seconds. Then it stops. Harmon's voice, uncertain for the first time. Did everyone hear that? Affirmative responses from the other three, overlapping, slightly urgent. Fisher, "We need to leave, now." There's no argument. The next sounds are movement, equipment being gathered quickly but not frantically, professional retreat. They'd trained for various cave emergencies, structural instability, rising water, gas accumulation, and this sounded like that kind of disciplined withdrawal. What happens next on the recording is where the case transforms from unusual to genuinely disturbing. At 12:23, there's a voice again, the same voice from earlier, but this time speaking a full paragraph. The words are distinct, measured, as though being read from prepared text. The formation requires specific conditions. Temperature variance of no more than 3 degrees across 5 years. Humidity constant at 72%. Minimal vibration. Your presence has introduced 17 separate disturbances in the past 40 minutes. The calibration is compromised. The voice isn't angry or threatening. It's informational, almost apologetic. What makes it unnerving is the complete impossibility of anyone else being in that cave. Shepherd's Drop had a single entrance, which the team had descended using rope systems. No one could have entered without using those same ropes, and the surface team would have noted any additional personnel. More disturbing, there's still no response from the team. Harmon doesn't ask who's speaking. Vetch doesn't demand identification. The retreat continues without interruption, as though the voice isn't there. At 12:27, the tape develops a new artifact, a low-frequency hum that sits just at the edge of human hearing. Audio analysis places it around 16 Hz, below the typical range of most recording equipment from that era. The hum continues for 90 seconds, gradually increasing in volume. Then, at 12:29, the recording ends. Not stopped, not paused. The audio simply ceases mid-stride, while Harmon is in the middle of calling out their position relative to the junction. The team emerged from Shepherd's Drop at approximately 1:40 in the afternoon. Their surface coordinator, a graduate assistant named Loretta Gaines, noted in her log that they seemed professionally composed but unusually quiet. standard procedure required immediate preliminary reports while observations were fresh. Instead, Harmon requested 2 hours before debriefing, saying they needed to review their notes and recordings first. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Complex surveys sometimes required time to process before formal reporting. What happened during those 2 hours remains unclear. What I know from later testimonies is that Harmon listened to the tape 3 times in his field tent, alone. Vetch and Price reviewed their sample collections. Fisher sat in his truck smoking, which colleagues said he only did when deeply troubled. At 4:15, Harmon called Gaines to his tent. What he told her was brief. The survey had proceeded normally until they encountered unexpected acoustic phenomena that suggested structural instability. He'd made the decision to withdraw and mark the location for specialized follow-up with seismic equipment. The preliminary survey was complete, and they'd resume with proper precautionary equipment in 2 weeks. This was a reasonable explanation. Caves sometimes produced unusual sounds due to airflow patterns or water movement through hidden fissures. Harmon's decision to withdraw was conservative, but defensible. The problem was the tape. Harmon handed it to Gaines, asking her to make a copy for the archives and return the original to him. Again, standard procedure. What wasn't standard was what she heard when she played it that evening. The recording was blank. Not blank as in erased, but as though nothing had ever been recorded. The tape ran for its full length, showing proper motor function, but contained only silence. Not even ambient noise. Pure, empty silence from beginning to end. Gaines assumed she'd been given the wrong tape. She contacted Harmon, who checked his equipment bag. There was only one tape, the one he'd already provided. She suggested the recording might have failed, perhaps a malfunction with the cassette mechanism. Harmon assured her the device had been functioning properly and promised to bring replacement equipment for the follow-up survey. But here's what I find significant. Harmon's field notes from that day, which I've examined extensively, contain detailed observations that should have corresponded to verbal recordings on the tape. He documented the passage measurements, the junction configuration, the unexpected pressure sensations, everything except the voices and the strange final sounds. His notes make no mention of any fifth person being present, or of hearing anything that couldn't be explained by natural cave acoustics. I've cross-referenced his written documentation with Fisher's maps, and they align perfectly with what the tape should have contained, at least until those final minutes. This suggests Harmon was documenting what he experienced in real time, not inventing observations later. The follow-up survey, scheduled for September 28th, never happened. On September 23rd, Fisher contacted the survey coordinator and withdrew from the project. He provided no explanation beyond family obligations, which was accepted without question. Fisher had been a reliable guide for over a decade. If he said he couldn't work, that was sufficient. On September 25th, Vetch submitted a memo requesting reassignment to a different survey area. Her stated reason was a potential conflict with her groundwater contamination research schedule. The request was granted. On September 27th, one day before the scheduled return to Shepherd's Drop, Harmon submitted a revised report indicating that Shepherd's Drop showed no features of significant geological interest and recommended removing it from the survey schedule. The cave was marked as cataloged no priority and dropped from active investigation. Price, the graduate student, completed his fieldwork rotation and returned to campus. He graduated in 1984 with a thesis on sandstone erosion patterns in the Arkansas River Valley. Shepherd's Drop isn't mentioned anywhere in his academic work. The case might have ended there, another unremarkable cave added to the extensive but not particularly noteworthy Geological Survey database of the Buffalo National River area. But two details prevented it from fading into complete obscurity. The first was Loretta Gaines, the surface coordinator. She'd only heard silence on the tape Harmon provided, but something about the team's behavior after emerging from the cave troubled her. She'd worked with enough field teams to recognize the difference between routine survey completion and something else, something harder to define. The way Harmon had requested those 2 hours, the way Fisher had sat alone in his truck, the way Vetch had avoided eye contact during their brief post-survey conversation. Gaines kept the blank tape. She labeled it with the survey date and location and filed it in her personal archives, not the official university collection. When I interviewed her in 2019, she was 73 years old and retired from academic geology. She told me she'd kept it because something about that survey never sat right with me, and I've learned to trust that feeling. The second detail was more concrete, the Sony TCM 600 recorder itself. In October of 1982, Harmon requisitioned a replacement recorder through University Equipment Management, citing equipment failure for the original device. This was standard procedure when field equipment malfunctioned. The failed equipment was supposed to be returned for potential repair or disposal. Harmon never returned it. Equipment records show the unit listed as lost in field location unknown as of November 1982. Harmon paid the replacement cost from his research budget, which closed the administrative matter. But equipment doesn't simply vanish from a controlled field survey, especially not durable professional recorders designed specifically for rough field use. In 1994, 12 years later, a property maintenance worker named Russell Kemp was clearing accumulated debris from a drainage culvert along Highway 65, about 20 miles north of Shepherd's Drop. He found a weathered canvas equipment bag wedged against the culvert's steel grating. Inside was a Sony TCM 600 recorder, serial number matching the unit Harmon had reported lost. Kemp, an amateur electronics hobbyist, cleaned the device and attempted to restore it. The external housing showed significant weathering, but the internal mechanisms were largely intact, protected by the sealed cassette compartment. After replacing corroded battery contacts, the device powered on. There was a tape inside. Kemp played it out of curiosity. He later described what he heard as 23 seconds of people talking in a cave, then something that sounded like wind, then nothing else. He found the content unremarkable and stored the recorder and tape in his garage, where they remained until 2003. That year, Kemp's daughter, who was studying geology at the University of Arkansas, mentioned the recorder during a conversation with her faculty advisor. The advisor, curious about potentially historical field recordings, asked to examine it. This led to the tape being digitized and, eventually, to its contents being compared against archived survey records. The match to the September 14, 1982 survey was made through voice identification. Harmon's voice was still on file in several archived lectures and presentations. The match was definitive. But why was the recorder in a drainage culvert 20 miles from the survey site? And why did the tape contain only 23 seconds of recording when Harmon had run it continuously for hours? I've developed a hypothesis based on the physical evidence and timeline, though I acknowledge it's speculative. The recorder was deliberately disposed of, but not immediately. The weathering patterns on the canvas bag suggest it was kept in a relatively protected environment for several months before being exposed to the elements. This matches a scenario where Harmon kept the device and tape for a period, perhaps trying to understand what had happened before eventually deciding to dispose of it. The location of disposal, a drainage culvert along a highway, Harmon regularly traveled between his home in Fayetteville and various survey sites, suggests opportunity rather than careful planning. He wanted it gone, but not in a way that would require explaining its destruction to University Equipment Management. But why dispose of it at all? If the tape had simply failed to record, as he'd claimed, why not return the defective equipment through proper channels? The answer, I believe, lies in what was actually on that tape. The 23 seconds recovered from the recorder matched the section from 11. 43 to 12, 06, in my reconstruction of the timeline. This is the period when the team approached the chamber expansion and the first anomalous voice appears. The fact that this specific segment survived while everything else was blank suggests deliberate partial erasure. Modern audio forensics has allowed for detailed analysis of those 23 seconds. What emerges is subtle but significant. There are 5 distinct voices on the recording. Harmon, Vetch, Price, and Fisher are clearly identifiable. The 5th voice, the one making the statement about bringing them here, has been isolated and analyzed. Its acoustic properties are unusual. The voice exhibits perfect clarity despite the cave environment that should have created some echo or distortion. Its frequency range is narrower than typical human speech, missing both the lowest bass tones and the highest harmonics that give voices their individual character. 3 separate audio analysts have described it as artificially constrained or filtered, though there's no evidence of the recording having been technically altered. More significantly, detailed waveform analysis reveals something that shouldn't be possible with 1982 cassette technology. The 5th voice shows no variation in volume, despite changes in distance from the microphone that would be inevitable in a narrow cave passage. The 4 team members' voices vary in volume as they move relative to the recorder, exactly as expected. The 5th voice maintains perfectly consistent amplitude throughout its brief statement. This suggests either highly sophisticated audio manipulation or something I'm less comfortable speculating about. The voice wasn't generated by a physical source in the cave. I've interviewed all 4 surviving team members. Fisher passed away in 1997, but I've obtained his personal papers through his family. What I've learned is fragmentary, carefully worded, and deeply frustrating for someone seeking clear answers. Harmon, now 87 and living in Tucson, agreed to speak with me on the condition that I not record our conversation. He was lucid, precise, and utterly unwilling to discuss the specifics of what happened in Shepard's Drop beyond what appeared in his official report. When I pressed him about the voices on the tape, he said only, "We heard what we heard. We documented what could be documented. Some things don't have explanations that satisfy anyone." Vetch, retired in Little Rock, was more forthcoming, but equally evasive about the crucial details. She confirmed experiencing the pressure sensation Harmon mentioned. She confirmed hearing unusual acoustic phenomena that they couldn't identify. When I asked specifically about the 5th voice, she was quiet for a long moment, then said, "If I told you what I thought I heard, you'd think I was fabricating it. If I told you what I'm certain I heard, you wouldn't believe me either, so I'll tell you this. We went into that cave as scientists, and we left as people who understand there are limits to what science can measure." Price, still teaching geology at Oklahoma State, refused to be interviewed entirely. His written response to my inquiry was brief. The 1982 Buffalo National River Survey was completed satisfactorily and documented according to professional standards. I have nothing to add beyond what appears in the official records. Fisher's papers, preserved by his widow, contained something more revealing, a personal journal he kept separate from his professional mapping work. The entry for September 14, 1982, is sparse but troubling. 30 years I've worked these hills, thought I knew every soundstone makes, every way water moves, every trick the dark plays on your senses. I was wrong. Some caves don't want to be mapped. Some places were meant to mark on paper and leave alone. Going back would be a mistake. There's a note added below, in different ink, dated October 1982. Harmon agrees. Vetch agrees. Price won't talk about it, but he agrees too. The cave stays off the schedule. In 1989, the Shepard property was finally settled legally and sold to a conservation trust. The new owners conducted a survey of the land's features for their management plan. Shepard's Drop was noted, photographed from the surface, and designated as a protected feature with restricted access due to safety concerns. I traveled to the site in 2021. The entrance is still there, though decades of accumulated debris have partially obscured it. The opening shows evidence of deliberate barrier installation at some point, steel posts set into the limestone with cable mesh stretched between them. The installation isn't documented in any official conservation records I could find, but the hardware dates to the mid-1980s based on manufacturing marks. Standing at that entrance, recorder in hand, I attempted to document the ambient sound environment. The recording captured exactly what you'd expect: wind moving through oak and hickory branches, distant bird calls, the subtle rustle of leaf litter. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would suggest why a professional geological survey team would collectively decide to bury their findings and never speak openly about what they experienced. But I noticed something Fisher might have appreciated. The sound changes when you stand directly at the entrance. The ambient noise doesn't disappear exactly, but it becomes muted, as though you're hearing it through a barrier that isn't visible. I've recorded at dozens of cave entrances. None of them created quite this effect. I didn't attempt to enter. The barrier is clearly marked with no trespassing signs, though they're weathered and probably decades old. More relevantly, I couldn't justify the risk based on what I might or might not find. Cave exploration without proper equipment and support is dangerous under any circumstances, but I did lower a digital recorder on a cable as far as the rope allowed, roughly 40 feet down, to where the shaft should open into the main passage. I left it recording for 30 minutes, then retrieved it. The recording was blank. Not silent with ambient sound, but completely blank. Exactly like the tape Gaines had received in 1982. The device showed no malfunction. The battery was good. The memory card tested functional. But those 30 minutes contained absolutely nothing. I've tried to understand what happened in Shepherd's Drop in September of 1982. I've examined the physical evidence, interviewed the witnesses who would speak with me, consulted with experts in acoustics and psychology and cave environments. The explanations fall into several categories, none of them entirely satisfactory. The first explanation is equipment failure. The recorder malfunctioned in a way that created apparent voices and sounds that weren't real, then failed completely. And the team's reluctance to discuss it stems from professional embarrassment about reporting faulty data. But this doesn't explain why all 4 members experienced the same sensory anomalies beyond what the recording captured. It doesn't explain Fisher's journal entry or the coordinated decision to avoid returning to the cave. The second explanation is psychological. Cave environments can create sensory distortions, especially in teams working under physical stress. The pressure changes they felt might have been real but misinterpreted. The sounds might have been natural but unfamiliar, triggering a collective anxiety response. But this doesn't explain the specific voice content on the tape, or why experienced cave explorers would be so fundamentally unsettled by routine acoustic phenomena. The third explanation is deliberate fabrication. Perhaps this entire case is a constructed narrative, a cautionary tale or academic joke that got out of hand. But I've verified the documentation, examined the physical evidence, interviewed multiple independent sources. If this is fabrication, it's extraordinarily elaborate and serves no clear purpose. The fourth explanation is one I hesitate to articulate because it ventures into territory that doesn't align with conventional investigation. But it's the explanation that Fisher's journal seems to suggest, that Vetch's careful evasion implies, that Harmon's refusal to discuss indicates. They encountered something in Shepherd's Drop that didn't fit their understanding of how caves, sound, or reality itself should function. And rather than risk their professional credibility by reporting it, they chose silence. What troubles me most about this case isn't the mystery itself, but the response to it. These were serious professionals with decades of combined experience. They didn't panic. They didn't dramatize. They simply stopped talking about it and ensured no one else would investigate. That kind of unified silence usually indicates either powerful institutional pressure or profound personal conviction. I found no evidence of the former, which leaves the latter, and that raises questions I'm not equipped to answer. In 1968, during a separate geological survey of the Buffalo National River area, a team reported unusual atmospheric conditions in a cave system approximately 15 miles southeast of Shepherd's Drop. The report noted unexplained pressure variations and acoustic anomalies that warrant further investigation. The follow-up investigation was scheduled for the following year but was canceled due to budget reductions. The cave's designation was changed to low priority, and it was effectively removed from active survey work. I found 3 other similar cases in archived geological records from the Ozarks between 1955 and 1991. All involved survey teams reporting unusual conditions in cave systems. All resulted in the caves being marked as low priority or restricted access. None resulted in published papers or detailed follow-up investigations. This pattern suggests the 1982 Shepherd's Drop survey wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something larger, a series of encounters with cave environments that produced consistent anomalous effects. Whether those effects were environmental, perceptual, or something else remains unclear. The recorder that captured 23 seconds of Shepherd's Drop is currently stored in my research archive. I've preserved it exactly as I received it, including the partially degraded tape. Sometimes I listen to those 23 seconds trying to hear what 4 professionals heard that made them choose silence over documentation. The voice that says, "You shouldn't have brought them here," is clear, measured, and impossible. It exists on the recording, but shouldn't be there. It speaks about the cave as though the cave itself has requirements, needs, specific conditions that must be maintained. Who was speaking? Where were they? Why didn't the team respond? I don't have answers. What I have is evidence that something happened in Shepherd's Drop on September 14, 1982, that 4 experienced professionals decided shouldn't be investigated further. I have a recorder that should have captured hours of routine survey work, but instead contains only 23 seconds of something unexplainable. And I have Virgil Harmon's words, spoken during our conversation in Tucson, when I asked him if he'd ever considered returning to Shepherd's Drop. Some caves map themselves, others don't want to be known. I learned which kind I was dealing with, and I respected that knowledge. The case remains unresolved. Shepherd's Drop is still there, still accessible to anyone willing to bypass a weathered barrier and descend 40 feet into darkness. The cave doesn't care whether we understand it. It simply exists, the way it has for thousands of years, holding whatever it holds. I've documented what I could verify. The rest remains where Fisher said it should, marked on paper and left alone.